Hello and welcome. So we're not quite yet in the total post-COVID age. So it's still a bit of a virtual community. But thank you everyone for joining us for this. I hate it when people say that a timely event, because sure, everything is timely except holding this particular conversation while Russia is further invading Ukraine, and not just an invasion, but literally destroying cities street by street and killing innocent women and children. There's never a better time to talk about what is animating the destabilizing forces in the world we live today, and how events and times that we thought were literally impossible in the modern world would be happening right at our doorstep. So the idea of looking at the Beijing-Moscow Axis and what it really is and what it really means, and more importantly, what to do about it, is maybe arguably one of the most important issues that we're facing in the world today. So we have a project at the Heritage Foundation called the China Transparency Project. So for like a few years now, including our partners here today, we've been trying to coordinate all the tremendous open source research being done on Chinese malicious activities, everything from domestic to foreign direct investment. And we have over 100 international stakeholders and partners around the world, and we collate all this information. We have a website on China Transparency. We have an annual report which looks at this information, evaluates it, looks at trends. We have a podcast, China Uncovered. But the whole purpose is, I think our strategy is if you can just show people in the world what the Chinese and Russians are doing, people can decide for themselves the way forward. And we think knowledge is the most crucial weapon and instrument that we bring to the table. So today we brought together some scholars from the Center for Eastern Studies and the Polish Institute of International Affairs for a roundtable to talk about their particular research, which actually came to us through looking at what everybody was doing in the China Transparency Project. These are two fantastic institutions which do incredible work. The Polish Institute for International Affairs is actually establishing a Washington, D.C. footprint, which do we know when that's going to happen? in the very near future. I think the transatlantic dialogue has never been honestly rich enough, and it hasn't really kept up, I think, with the times, focusing on the issues that are critical and important. And to have the Institute here in Washington, D.C., because we work with them for years, and they literally are, I think, doing some of the best and most cutting edge research on Russia and China and a range of issues. This is really going to be, I think, a real jumpstart to that dialogue. So having them here today, I think, is a taste of the kinds of conversations that we're going to be able to develop over the months and years ahead. And I just think that is going to be so incredibly empowering and powerful. So thank you for them. Thanks to the center. I'm gonna kick it over our first panel. We're going to do 2 sessions, and I think the way to organize this is we should spend the first session really looking at what this research really tells us. And so when people say, well, we should make friends with Russia because we really ought to focus on China, or, well, China's not really a problem. People can have any ideas or any views that they want, but it ought to be grounded in what we actually know. So I think it would be really helpful to spend this first session looking at what the objective, quantitative, analytical data says about these countries, their objectives, and more importantly, how they impact the interests of America and the nations of Europe. And then I think that really sets up a second session where I hope we can really kind of throw this open and talk about, okay, so what do we do about that? I mean, we know what people are doing in Ukraine today to help out the people of Ukraine. We would have all hoped that we had started that months ago, and maybe we wouldn't be where we are today. But there's no do-overs in history, and what will happen in Ukraine will play out. But Ukraine is the crisis before the next crisis. So we have to think beyond the immediate as to what we need to do in terms of a range of policies. And I can't think of and I hope everyone will stay for the second part, because I can't think of a better group of scholars and folks to really engage in a deep, thoughtful discussion about what do we do now. So with that, let me turn it over to our first panel. And I think we're just going to go in the order listed, right? I think. Is that correct? No. Okay, but you know what? You guys decide, and I'll just turn it over to you, and we'll launch off. So there we go. So.
Yeah, thanks, James, for a wonderful introduction. Thanks for having us here. Indeed, I think we are in a very special moment with regards to the China-Russia relationship, a moment in which basically the whole world wants to decode on what's going on between the two and how to interpret Beijing's stance towards Russia. Because it's not only about the political support, but also the things that are coming ahead. That is, the questions like, would China throw Russia a lifeline, economic lifeline, as Moscow faces the economic crisis, what appears to be a financial collapse, but also what's the way forward here. But I think, as you said, we'll leave it maybe to the second question, second section. And here, I personally like to focus on the structural underpinnings of this relationship. So just a few words on myself and the institution. My name is Jakub Jakubowski. I'm a senior fellow at the China program at the Center for Eastern Studies. We are the other big state institution, state analytical center in Poland, focusing mostly on the post-Soviet space initially, but then we've gradually expanded into places like China, Turkey, Central Europe, or Germany. And today, I'm happy to present main points of our recent report on that's called Beijing-Moscow Axis, the foundations of an asymmetric alliance. So just to make things clear here, within the broader debate on what's going on between Moscow and Beijing, our stance is that this is a very rich and deep bond that goes beyond ad hoc coordination, but has deep roots, and those are the roots I'd like to talk about. And I firmly believe that this bond that they've built, that they've invested in for last at least 20, 25 years, bear fruit just now. And the things we see between Beijing and Moscow, and especially the things we see in Beijing itself now, which I would call not only a tacit support for Russia, because if we look at the official statements, the official messaging, Beijing talks about NATO's fall, US fall, pushing Russia to the wall, opposing sanctions, calling for a new security mechanism in Europe. And although we do not see a direct support for the invasion or military means, but in terms of political goals that Putin has in mind, China's rhetorics and actions are basically fully in line with what he does. And once again, we believe that this stems from a very rich and deep relationship they've managed to build, one that was not predestined to be as strong. During the last 30 years, both Russia and China were basically trying to establish their own relationships with the West. For the Russians, it was recurring bids to be a part of the European system, but on the Russian terms. That means having their sphere of influence and basically also corrupting the system that was already in place. So they were, rejected for a number of times, and as we see now, for right reasons. For China, it was trying to postpone its conflict with the West for as long as possible. And this also was taken with skepticism in Moscow for a long time. But cutting the long story of the relationship short, We believe that 2011 and 12 was a moment where a final alignment took place, with Putin coming to power again after Medvedev, with a new situation of an increasing authoritarian, a little bit totalitarian setting. And on the other hand, we've seen Xi Jinping coming to power in China, a moment that changed the course of Chinese history and global history too. Two autocratic leaders with clear revisionist objectives in their minds, aligning themselves, and then entering direct conflict with the West politically and economically of Russia post 2014, and then slightly a few years after Trump's administration, major shift of the U.S. policy and an open structural conflict with China. And at this very moment, both Moscow and Beijing came up to a conclusion that their conflict with the West is structural. It cannot be settled by any, modus vivendi. It's just too structural to be settled, and that they need to band together to push against the West, and in particular the U.S., because this is in their minds the main master of puppets, because that's their view of international institutions, that's their view of the European Union. They see the U.S. influence everywhere, not only strategically, but also in terms of what they call color revolutions. So all in all, just to kind of wrap it up, we believe that, once again, it's a strong and mature bond that can be called and referred to as an alliance, an informal alliance. It's not formal. China is not entering formal alliances. It doesn't want to bind their hands too much. But if you look at the actual interests and stated goals, there's an overlap that's so strong that this forms a very solid foundation. And I would name two main pillars here, one being the strategic synergy between Beijing and Moscow that we saw spelled out openly on February 4th in their joint communication in Beijing, where they basically stated that they view Europe and the Indo-Pacific as two systemically connected theaters in Eurasia, when they're basically pushing against the US-led effort and US-led coalitions that they perceived are about to squeeze them, to squeeze both Russia and Beijing from those two sides, and that they see that there's a certain synergy there. If the US is involved in Europe, or if in Asia, the other way around, then or if Russia and China has more space to develop their own policy. But and this, I think, led China to giving Russia a green light to what is happening. We may discuss it, and we will probably in the second stage. Was China really expecting the things that are going on? And was Putin expecting the course of events that we see now? But leaving this aside, the February 4th meeting was, I think, a watershed moment, where a moment in which this relationship went beyond bilaterals and entered a global stage. And the first pillar of this relationship I was talking about is the strategic synergy that we see now, opposing any small groupings in the Pacific, meaning then AUKUS and Quad, China opposing NATO and blaming NATO for the things that are going on. This is a very, very strong bond between the two. The other strongest pillar being the ideological bond. Both Russia and China, and here we are talking about not merely an alliance between two states in realist terms, we're talking about an alliance of two authoritarian elites, Putin's elite and the CCP, that perceive the global liberal order as a major threat to their continuous rule. They perceive what they call revolutions as the biggest threat to their rule, not only inside Russia and China, but also in what they perceive as their spheres of influence, so places like Kazakhstan, Belarus, Hong Kong. They've been constantly calling this openly a US-led effort to overthrow authoritarian regimes, and they kind of building propaganda and security infrastructure, internal security infrastructure, to withstand this what they perceive as a big pressure, which in their view is a US effort, but in reality, it's those two countries living within the liberal world order, which is at odds with everything they stand for. So strategic considerations and then the ideological bond, the two strongest ones. And then we have a number of different areas of their relationship, like economy, third countries, some very specific sectoral things worldwide, economic integration of Eurasia. And here I would say, not to go too deep, leaving the space for my colleagues here. Tensions occur, diverging interests occur, but I think the lessons we learn, especially looking at the things that we look at in our report, they accept that there are divergent interests, but they're secondary to this main battle they think they fight in what the Chinese call the Bei-Kao-Bei, like back-to-back coordination. There are like two boxers fighting back-to-back against the US, and the rest the tensions are secondary here. Thanks.
Can I, before we move on, can I just ask one question? Just to clarify, because I think you raise a really, really good point. And it relates particularly now to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where a lot of people say, well, we shouldn't be focusing on Russia because the real enemy is China. And you kind of very clearly made the point that that Russia and China kind of see the relationship with the United States as a zero-sum game. So anything that's good for the United States is bad for both of them. And anything that's bad for the United States is good for both of them. And in the case of the Ukraine invasion, a successful invasion of Ukraine, which further which if it resulted in the further division and weakening, whether it did or not, we can discuss. But if it resulted in the further, or even the threat of the invasion, if it resulted in the further weakening and dividing of Europe, the Chinese would say, well, that's good for us because that creates new opportunities. And the whole idea behind 17+1 was to divide the Europeans and do deals with them individually and essentially do divide and conquer. So in a sense, when the West pushes back against Russia in Ukraine, that's part of dealing with the China threat. So is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but does that make sense?
It totally makes sense to me. I think the primary purpose of Xi Jinping giving this the green light, to the Russians was that both Putin and Xi Jinping were hoping that this will drive a wedge within the EU and between the European Union and the US, and everything that's bad for the transatlantic relationship is good for China, because their biggest fear is a strong transatlantic coalition that can basically, alter the system that now favors China.
And because this is a big issue for the second panel, but the single most important thing that China doesn't want is the last thing they want is a healthy, cohesive, prosperous transatlantic community. That's the nightmare scenario for them. Is it?
Yeah, I think Justina was about to talk about precisely about this point.
So let's move on then. Yeah, because I don't. But yeah. So let's move on.
Thanks a lot. Because I would like to focus, because Kuba presented the main results of the research when it comes to Moscow-Beijing Axis, which is a pretty big topic. 2 years ago, we published in our institute the report, which was, let's say, the topic was narrower. We asked themselves the question how China and Russia could join forces against the European Union. And if they could join forces, when it's possible. Bearing in mind what is going on right now, I think that we could replace this European Union with West. I think it would be the best option. And I would like to focus not about the content of the report, but on two elements. We, in one of the chapter, we tried to define the so-called toolbox of damage. So what kind of actions and tools China and Russia could jointly use in order to undermine the EU right now, let's say, undermine the West, democratic world, liberal world. So I like to focus on this list of those tools, have a look what we thought 2 years ago and what kind of tools or actions have been already used by those two countries against us, let's say, against West, because what we are now facing is, it's not a question if those two countries could join forces, they already joined forces and try to undermine us. And the second point that I would like to also focus on from the report, we try to define under what circumstances China and Russia could join forces. So looking back 2 years ago when we have this report and looking right now what is going on. And before I start, maybe the main conclusion of the report was that the China-Russia alliance, if I may put it in this way, could directly, let's say, affect European Union or the West, but of course the most important issue is the United States. So the EU is a, let's say, not very important target because both China and Russia benefit when it comes to economic cooperation. So it was our, let's say, conclusion 2 years ago. To be frank, right now, I think that both China and Russia could do something which is which was difficult to imagine 2 years ago, because looking what China is doing backing Russia when it comes to Russian invasion against Ukraine and what Russia is doing, launching this, let's say, traditional kinetic war, not like a hybrid war, it is not, let's say, reasonable. But I think that right now we should think out of the box because situation is completely changed. So going back to this toolbox of damage, those, as I said, those are actions or tools that China and Russia may jointly use to attempt damage, let's say, and undermine the West. And the toolbox starts with the most feasible tactics they might compile and ends with the last likely instruments to be utilized. It was 2 years ago. I think that right now we are observing a situation that 2 years ago we thought it's difficult to imagine. So I would like to focus on our assumption or our conclusion 2 years ago and what we are observing right now. So we have 7 or 8 those tools of actions. The first one is coordinated direct economic pressure. And 2 years ago, we thought that it could be, like, say, from Russian side, energy blackmail or limit gas export to the EU, from the Chinese side, cut off or limit export of some products or some, let's say, elements like active pharmaceutical ingredients or rare earth minerals. But what we're observing right now, it's a good discussion, is if it's a parallel or coordinated actions just before the war, just from the Russian side, high prices of gas, from the Chinese side, the coercion against Lithuania and multinationals, which is a pretty new Chinese behavior, the crossing the red lines, weaponization of the supply chains. The second tool or actions that we identified 2 years ago is a coordinated strategy to influence EU decision-making from within, in a sense to corrupt politicians, discredit politicians, and create a political vacuum for anti-EU, anti-NATO political forces. And look what is happening right now and before the war. Some kind of what Orban is talking about the war, about the Le Pen or Salvini. So this kind of very extreme political forces, they are pretty active. The third tool or action is a coordination information and disinformation campaign using traditional media and cyberspace to influence EU population or Western population and decision makers with, let's say, 4 messages: anti-US, anti-NATO, anti-EU, and anti-liberal. And of course, what is going on right now? We have this information campaign from Russia. It's pretty obvious for us. We get used to it. But since the beginning of the pandemic, we saw and we experienced Chinese disinformation. And of course, what is going on right now, what China what's China's narrative about what Russia is doing, is also kind of an disinformation, I think. The fourth element is that decision makers in the member states and the EU and in the West could be presented that with the benefits that results from joining or cooperating with some kind of ideas or initiatives set up by China or Russia. I'm talking about Belt and Road Initiative, or let's say some benefits when it comes to Russia of long-term contracts for supply or natural resources or new transport routes. And what we are seeing when it comes to Russia before the war, now situation is different. And of course, this push for Nord Stream 2. And of course, various, let's say, proposal from China to cooperate when it comes to transport, Belt and Road Initiative, and so on. The fifth element is that both countries may use the diasporas in the EU as a pretext and instrument to meddle in the European or Western, including intelligence collection. And what we are seeing, I think that is the Russian narrative also before the war, before the aggression on Ukraine, that what Russia would like to do is to protect its own citizens. And what we are also observing right now, it's a kind of rhetoric from Chinese nationals living or being right now in Ukraine, that they are also trying to send a message what is going on in Ukraine to Russian authorities. There's some news about it. The sixth element is use the military and economic presence in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa to fuel regional instability and worsen the migration crisis. And I think what we look what happened in Poland in the mid 2021, when there was a pretty big border crisis when it comes to the migrants between Polish, Belarusian, and Lithuanian Belarusian border, that Lukashenko, together with Putin, it was probably inspiration from Moscow, let's say, invited, if I may put it, some immigrants from the Middle East, and then they pushed them to go to the European Union to destabilize the eastern flank of NATO and the EU. And what China was doing at that time, China was pretty silent when it comes to this crisis, but tried to use this crisis in its tensions with Lithuania, when Lithuania decided to set up the Taiwanese office in Vilnius, saying that, I would like to quote the title from Global Times, that is from running secret prisons for US to torturing refugees, about some dark history, some kind of that there is some human rights abuses on the Lithuanian-Belarusian border, also some kind of rhetoric about some Lithuanian participation in the Holocaust during the Second World War, this kind of narrative. And the last point is about, and we thought 2 years ago that it's even impossible scenario, but it's coordinated hostile military action against European and US interest in Europe, in Asia. Of course, when it comes to China, we thought about some kind of aggressive steps in South China Sea, Vietnam, Taiwan, or Japan, in Russia. And what we are observing right now, further aggression against Ukraine or NATO or EU. And of course, what we are observing right now is we have a war, Russia's aggression on Ukraine, and China's support, pretty open and explicit support for Russia. And the last point, because in our report we have also a short chapter about under what circumstances China and Russia may join forces against, let's say, the West. There are two, let's say, circumstances. The first one is increased transatlantic cooperation with the focus of alliance of democracies, the preservation of liberal order, And this is what we are observing right now. And of course, because of the change of the US approach towards the EU and the development of common agenda, better coordination of transatlantic relations, and also some joint transatlantic response when it comes to Chinese and Russian aggressive actions. So this is what we are observing right now. But it could be also a moment for China and Russia closer cooperation under the circumstances of, let's say, existential crisis in the Euro-Atlantic community, but also within the EU. If we have some divisions between United States and Europe, but also within the Europe, so it would be a very good moment for China and Russia to, let's say, to select some countries to play them. But fortunately, we saw right now the first scenario, so this increased transatlantic cooperation. And in the end, if I may, because from the analytical point of view, we can say after the 2 years, in the 2 years perspective, that we are right. And frankly speaking, I do not want to say that we told you so, because I would like to say that I wish we were not right.
So we're actually racing through the time for the first panel, and maybe we can carry over some of that in the second panel. But just really quickly, did you have any specific thoughts on the experience of Lithuania and their connections with Taiwan and the Chinese response to that? Could you have a quick maybe thought about what that represents?
If I can connect it with the situation in Russia, so we have the same. What Russia is trying to do right now is testing us as a West, how we could respond to this crisis when it comes to the security dimension. What China is doing is trying also to test us, and I think that credibility and security when it comes to economic issues is at stake of the West, because China is trying to look what we can do if China use the coercive measures, which are informal, to be frank. There is no any announcement about the sanctions.
But the point of that is even though Lithuania is small and the connection with Taiwan is really not strategically significant, the Chinese go after them to test to see if there's real resolve in the transatlantic community about supporting a country.
Exactly, because it's not only coercion against Lithuania. That's the point. Because it's what China is trying to do is to hit not only Lithuania but also other countries.
Okay, so we got about 10 minutes, guys. So, but we'll get back in the second panel. So we'll split that as you wish.
Right. Thank you very much. I will focus on how China's Russia cooperation increases the risk of the big war in Europe, actually, because we now have war, pretty intensive conflict, the unprovoked aggression of Russia against Ukraine. But my analysis indicate that Putin could be encouraged to carry on with his aggression against Ukraine, calculating that he will receive at least political support from China. And when we look at the sequence of events, we can easily defend this thesis. But first of all, we will find in both of the reports this idea that China and Russia, they share the common strategic goal, which is to undermine the rules-based international order. They understand this order as the system that has been mainly built by the United States and its allies after the Second World War, since the Second World War. And it was secured, its stability was secured by the US power and ability to project force to any region in the world and to solve crises, even if there were interests of major powers involved. And of course, China and Russia tried to undermine this system by political means. But it seems that they are interested in undermining the United States and the West in general ability to bring stability to this system in a big way, that it will impact the whole world psychologically, and it will have a political effect. So to do this, you just need to demonstrate that United States and the West is unable to solve the crisis. And of course, so this is the first strategic goal of both China and Russia. And I would say that it is, there are a lot of analysis that, of course, historically they had a lot of conflicting interests, and it is not in the interest of Russia to become too dependent on China. But at the same time, when you analyze how Putin and his cronies, how they run the policy, it seems that this is not a factor, that their primary goal of undermining the Euro-Atlantic security system that we've been developing since the collapse of the Soviet Union for the last 30 years, that it is such a strong, vital interest that any dependence on China does not count at this moment. And the secondary goal, also very, very strong and connected with the first one, is that both actors, they try to undermine the security systems, Russia in Euro-Atlantic space, especially by reintegrating the post-Soviet space. A couple of years ago, when you would say that Russia is trying to recreate a new empire by reintegrating the post-Soviet space, you would hear, okay, those Poles are, as always, they are exaggerating. But now you can clearly see, and it is just like put on the table, that by political statements that Ukraine is not even a state, that you need to carry out denazification of Ukraine. So actually, you have everything prepared in rhetorical space to do some terrible things like the genocide in Ukraine. And of course, when you look at the Russian policy towards Belarus, it's almost totally integrated into the so-called Union state. So in a couple of years, if we would be very reactive, if we wouldn't try to stop Russia and to impose costs and to defend Ukraine, we would be discussing, what is the level of independence, sovereignty of Belarus within the Union state or Ukraine within the Union state. So we would have a new political entity very close to what we had during the Soviet times. But what is very important, that I don't want to make it too long, because I would like to leave some time for this discussion. What is important here is to understand that Putin probably got encouraged by the political support that he received from China. We had this statement from the beginning of February, and in this statement, both states clearly said that Russia and China stand against attempts by external forces to undermine security and stability in their common adjacent regions. So this means that both states believe that they have the right for their spheres of influence. And this is what the war in Ukraine is about. This is not only about Ukraine. This is about the whole European security architecture and the whole global rules-based order. So there is also important element in this statement that both sides opposed further NATO enlargement. So it is a clear message that China offered political support to Russia in its attempt to establish the sphere of influence and to reintegrate at least part of the post-Soviet space into this new political entity that will appear soon if we do not take decisive actions. So just 20 days after this statement, Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine, to go into full-scale war. And if somebody makes this argument that, okay, they annexed Crimea in 2014, they tried to undermine territorial integrity of Ukraine further by offering support to Lugansk and Donetsk republics, but we have a completely different security situation now. When he decided that he's not going to negotiate any longer in this Minsk format to achieve any kind of political compromise through this political process, he decides to go into the full-scale war, and at the same time he demands the so-called security guarantees from the West, which are included in the formal documents that they would like to be signed by United States and NATO, the proposals of new treaties between Russia and NATO and Russia and United States, where Russia demands that NATO withdraws its forces to the positions from 1997. It demands that NATO gives up on its principle that any state can join the alliance if it meets certain criteria. One of the fundamental principles of the security of European architecture, that any state has the right to choose its own alliances. And it also demands that NATO and the United States imposes some limitations on the ability to deploy troops to the new EU and NATO member states. So it also would like to undermine the credibility of United States security guarantees for the allies. So Russia invades Ukraine. It starts a big war, but it also threatens the West that if Russian demands are not met, the conflict can escalate up to the nuclear level, and rising the nuclear forces alert by Russia is a clear signal.
So we've only got about a minute left in this session, but do you have any thoughts about the Chinese response? I don't know how far the Chinese knew this was going to go. Certainly threatening was useful to them, but now that there's an all-out war and it's not a quick war and it could get very ugly, and the Chinese are having to go out there and essentially front for the Russians, in which are some horrific atrocities. And unlike the Uyghur genocide, people can see all this happening in real time. What do you think the Chinese are feeling right now? And then we're going to go to break.
I think that that they still offer this support that Justina mentioned, especially in the political support, but also through the information in the information domain. That they clearly try to demonstrate that this is not Russia's fault. That this is just like an special operation, not a full-scale war, and there is a lot of Western disinformation. So it can go on like this for months.
Yeah. In the West, we call it damage control and spin, which I actually think doesn't work for the Chinese, because it actually looks less credible, because everybody knows what's going on, and they're basically spinning a line which is just blatantly, obviously false. So I think we'll take the break, and we'll come back, and I think Marcin will kick us off. And then we have a comment, and we'll go from there. Great. All right. So we'll see everybody in 15 minutes. Great. All right. Welcome back. We had some technical things, but for those of you who are just joining us, two fantastic reports by the Center for Eastern Studies and the Polish Institute for International Affairs, really kind of unpacking in a very data heavy way exactly the level of Chinese-Russian cooperation and the motivations behind that. And I think a great foundation for talking about, okay, well, what do we do about it? So I'm going to kick it right to the panel, and then if we have some time, we're gonna do some questions and answers. And for those of you who are listening, we are going to put out the information, the connection to the two reports. If you don't get that and you need that, please just contact us at Heritage, and we'll make sure that we get the links to the reports to you. So let me just hand that back down. That one. Try yours and see if it works. Nope, just go with that.
Okay. Hello, and thank you very much for being here. And Let me just dive into a little bit on current situation and the Chinese relations with Russia in the context of Russian aggression in the Ukraine. My colleagues told a lot about the actual de facto alliance between China and Russia and the basics to it and how it reflects and how it influences the security architecture and so on. But I think the question is right now, and it gave a little bit of an answer why China actually supported Russia and why we signed the February 4th declaration and statement. But the question is now, how does China respond to the situation on the ground and especially the humanitarian crisis and the ongoing aggression and the level of aggression which Ukrainians are experiencing and which we can observe. And I think what we have to somehow analyze it, not from the perspective of Chinese being pragmatic in their foreign policy or in their relations, but rather from the perspective of their ideological stance and their intra-party dynamics and the ideology being important feature in Chinese thinking and Chinese authorities' actions. So first, this is the anti-Western trend and the narrative and policies which started long ago, but they were actually very much strengthened during the Xi Jinping's regime, with document number 9 and the whole policies towards the rivalry with the West, not only in terms of economy or military, but mainly in terms of ideology, and which we observed quite recently, the whole notion of the Chinese system being better in terms of its democratic values and in terms of being better than the American one, being better than the liberal democracies. I think it's quite important in terms of answering the question why China actually still supports Russia in its actions in the Ukraine, despite different signals which it might be sending, like abstaining from the United Nations Security Council voting or following some of the sanctions. These are not real. These are definitely not signals which can sign the change of Chinese policy, because it's very difficult to actually change the whole ideology of party and then its legitimacy based on Chinese system, a notion that Chinese system and Chinese decisions and Chinese way of thinking about the international world and about the democracy itself, about how to do foreign policy, that is better than the Western one. So in a top-down system, as we all know, and limited, it's very limited extremely to actually be able to change it in a first in a short period of time, and actually, but then also in terms of the party inner circle and Xi Jinping's ability to actually take decisions. And still, we have to take into consideration that, of course, a situation is dynamic, and we still cannot be sure how far and which way the situation in Ukraine will go, and that China is actually waiting and keeping its all options on the table. So supporting Russian narrative in most of the statements, not probably in all of the statements by the foreign ministry, and but also signaling some kind of not disagreement, but kind of some kind of territorial integrity of different countries, United Nations Charter, and so on. We just had today, actually, while we speaking, or quite a bit, not while we speaking, but a couple hours ago, there was a telephone call by Minister Wang Yi to Ukrainian Foreign Minister. They discussed, and as it says in the Chinese readout from the telephone call, first of all, it says again about the danger of expanding military blocks and the way how it could be perceived as a threat to the security of different countries. Russia is, of course, not mentioned directly, but it is a direct association. And of course, and then if we look at the readout, it says mostly about the security of the citizens and the way and cooperation between Ukraine and China on evacuation or taking care of Chinese citizens in the Ukraine. It is an important fact, but I would not go deep into the feeling that it means something more than just Chinese foreign minister showing his interest in the feelings and in the state of Chinese citizens in Ukraine, which is probably demanded by the Chinese public, and it is a sign, especially if there are rumors of Chinese citizens being hurt and wounded in Ukraine, actually. So what can we do about it? And by we, I mean the West, so-called. First of all, I think the unity is very much important. The unity of the West, which will show China that its thoughts and policy planning based on the differences between the EU and the US before the conflict, that they were wrong, and that's important to keep it during the upcoming months and weeks. Then, of course, we can influence China in its position as a member of United Nations Security Council, but I would not expect very much. I mean, but third thing which we can actually do is to create the level of sanctions in a way that it will be very serious challenge for the Chinese to actually not to follow, that it will hurt the Chinese economy in a way that will consider not following the sanctions imposed by the US and the EU on Russia. To some extent, it is actually working, but I think it needs better. It needs a follow-up and needs to be advanced. So I'll stop here. Yeah.
Good. So generally, we face the situation now with this war in Europe that can escalate into a much bigger conflict, into a conflict between Russia and NATO, because we can see that nuclear signaling, organizing by Russia large-scale exercises close to NATO borders. It is a traditional tactics of brinkmanship. So Russia tries to influence the Western threat perception, so it does not offer meaningful support for Ukraine. At the same time, as it was already said, we can see that there is a very rapid response from the Western side of historical proportions. So the calculations that the West will be weak divided definitely did not materialize. But the fact is that this war already changes the whole security situation in Europe, and we can have further escalation, but also we need to be prepared for a long-term threat, even if Russia decides that it is unable to achieve its goals in Ukraine and it needs to adapt. We probably will see the same pattern as we have seen before after the war with Georgia in 2008, when Russia just tried to adapt, to adjust, but it has not given up on its strategic goals, and it still pursued its goals by intimidation, coercion, and when it found the good opportunity to use military power or to change the status quo, Putin just decided to go for this. But the important thing is that China will probably expect a payback. So it means that if China decides to escalate tensions in the South China Sea around Taiwan, or if there is a conflict, we will probably see a similar support on the political level, in the informational domain, but also through military exercises that both states remember that they have carried out a number of military exercises that can be just interpreted as political signaling. But during the crisis, if we could see just like Russian ships being sent to the South China Sea or Chinese ship deployed to the Mediterranean, it could also have a very potentially have quite significant political consequences, that some states would start calculate how to interpret their interest and whether to really support the Western camp or maybe to play the game of sitting on the sidelines. So actually, we can see that the West is getting more and more coherent at this particular moment, but we cannot be sure how long it will take. And we should probably take the initiative to seize the momentum and offer the as big as possible support for Ukraine at this moment. This is the moment where actually we are defending the European security architecture and global security architecture. China will draw conclusions from the Western actions, from the scale of the support, the speed of action. So we just have to deny Russia any benefits from this aggression against Ukraine, and it will be a strategic signal to China that if it decides to solve the differences of interests in the South China Sea, if it wants to reclaim the control over Taiwan by military force, not through the political process, it needs to be convinced that at least half of the world will be against China. It will support the international coalition that will be determined to impose costs on China. This is the best way to strengthen the deterrence, and we just need to do it now by offering the military support.
Thank you. So I want to bring Peter into the conversation, and also if he has a question. So do we have a microphone that we could get to Peter? But while we're waiting for a microphone, I want to ask a question of the panel. So there are two big competencies, competitive issues, advantages here, which are relevant to both theaters, and they're energy and military force. So the only thing that really makes Russia relevant in Western Europe, I mean, hybrid warfare, green men, everything else aside, is the fact that he has a powerful military and the fact that they sell a lot of energy. I think it's really been remarkable how much NATO has responded on the military side in just the near term, with Germans going to 2%. Today, the Romanians said they're going to 2.5. Belgians going, with a socialist government's going to 1.9. So there at least there's some activity on the physical security side, and of course the transatlantic NATO is never going to be a real tipping point, or even an individual European power is not going to be a real tipping point in terms of the military balance of forces in the Indo-Pacific. That's just not going to happen, right? So, but having said that, there is, with things like the Quad and AUKUS, the submarine agreement with Australia and UK, and Japan, and the United. So I think there's a recognition that we need to look at the military balance in the Asia Pacific too. So I don't think that's, to me. So I want to come back on energy, because I do get a sense that it's huge in the transatlantic theater because of the dependence on Russian energy. I still don't see a real momentum, even in the midst of the invasion, to deal with that. So I'd like the panel thought on that. And it's a different problem with China, which China is an enormous major energy consumer, and as long as they can have wide access to vast amounts of energy, they're going to continue to thrive as an economic power. And of course, you cannot have a discussion about global energy competition without talking about climate change, because if you look at the Climate Action Plan, which has been endorsed really by all European governments, and which is the flavor of the month in this administration, it calls for a heavy dependence on renewables and a rapid transition from fossil fuels, which is geopolitically incoherent with what you would want to do to deal with the energy competition in both Europe and Asia. So I'd be interested in some thoughts on the energy piece of this, and then I really would like to hear Peter's contribution. And then we'll, so let's do the. If anybody has any thoughts on the energy thing, go to Peter and then come back to the panel. So anybody?
I'd just like to say that now, I mean, right now, if you look at the structure of the sanctions, energy is not on the table still. We've seen crushing financial sanctions on Russia, but so far all the institutions and companies in Russia that export gas and oil are not severely affected. There are like secondary sanctions that affect that. I just would like to say that if the transatlantic community was to take on that and try to cut this link now, there's a very interesting intra-Russian infrastructural setting that will affect their options. Because in terms of oil, they are basically free to juggle their supply and move it from Europe to China, if provided China wanted that. They have a very diversified portfolio. They care for to have Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Angola in their supply. But if Russia and China wanted to divert this stream, they will be able to do that. But natural gas is a very different thing. And so far, we have two natural gas pipeline systems in Russia that are not connected. So Russia is basically not able to divert this stream that now goes to Europe into China, and they will not be able to do that until the power of Siberia is built. So I saw in the news today that Russia is again like trying to push hard to get this thing built. But until they did that, we have a tremendous leverage over them here because they are, even if the Chinese wanted to buy it, they would just technically, that would be impossible for them. Thanks.
Yeah, and there is one. There are so many things going on in Europe now, and they are going on so fast that you can see that the total change of the perception of the European societies, of the perception of Russia. And now what we've been just like telling about this dependence on Russian oil and gas, that it is a huge vulnerability. And we published a report on this when trying to demonstrate that there is a nexus between this energy dependence and our hard security, that this blackmail, energy blackmail can be used to divide the alliance, to divide European countries. And that Russia is definitely playing this card. It tries to still rise the prices to deepen the energy crisis that we see now. But at the same time, we can see that Nord Stream 2 is suspended, and I just cannot imagine that it will become operational in the foreseeable future. It is probably gone for good. And we also see that in Germany, there is a very strong debate now that this dependency is a strategic liability. And Germany, I'm not sure if it is just like a done deal, but it seems that they are ready to build 2 LNG terminals to decrease further the dependence on, or just to start to decrease the dependence from Russia. Poland just built an LNG terminal a couple of years ago, and it has the option to build a new one, and probably it is also something that will take place in the coming years. And United States is increasing its export of LNG, and we signed the agreements. Poland signed a number of agreements with the United States of LNG deliveries. So this is the way how we can try to deal with this vulnerability and deny Russia the leverage over the Europeans in the short term.
I'd also like to raise the point, and if anyone wants to comment on the panel, that one of the Russian strategies has been the funding of Western NGOs to undercut energy projects that compete with Russia or threaten dependence on Russia. And in a sense, there's been a weaponizing of kind of the green movement, which in the end just winds up actually giving the Russians more power as opposed to actually aiding the transition to a green economy.
This is probably one of those areas where you can see Russian influence, but at the same time, I think that we still will have to continue this debate about the transition. Some countries want to do it much faster. Mm-hmm. Than others, but I am pretty sure that we will need to find a proper balance, because we cannot deny that this is absolutely important area for majority of the societies, that they want to see this green transition in practice taking place pretty fast. So this is the conflicting situation now,
right?
And for some countries, like hopefully, they will be able to cushion the negative effect of decoupling from Russia, but we will need to think big here as well.
Right, and I guess my point is, we have to be geopolitically coherent, right? So, having a green agenda. I mean, we just had the U.S. energy envoy John Kerry say, well, I hope that the fact that there's an ongoing war and a genocide against Ukrainians doesn't interfere with our cooperation with Russia on climate change, which of course is nonsense. I mean, Russia doesn't care about cooperation on climate change. They care about geopolitical conquest. And, and conversely, we've heard China commit to climate goals, and then we've seen China turn right around and say, oh yeah, by the way, there's absolutely no way we're actually going to ever achieve our climate goals. And they're the most rapidly growing, expanding use of coal. So, I mean, the reality is China as a polluter is going to undermine the green transition of everybody else. And the notion of, well, they need to cooperate with us, that's just not a workable strategy, because they're not. And if we're not having a robust, if we're not addressing not just the transition to the green economy, but also energy security and energy independence, and figure out how to balance those priorities, China and Russia aren't worried about that. And so this is a crucial geopolitical challenge, and in a sense, we can't do a lot of the things that you guys talk about unless we can figure out how we're going to manage the balance of developing reliable, affordable, abundant energy and being a good steward of the planet. And if we can't figure out a way to do both of those, we're kind of hamstringing our own ability to engage in this geopolitical competition with Russia and China. I'd love to bring Peter Duran, our good friend, into the conversation here. And you have a comment or a question for the panel?
Thanks, Jim. I just wanted to echo something you just said about hypocrisy. It reminded me of a famous quote by Vladimir Lenin back in the day when he said, "We will sell the West the rope that we will hang them with." And it strikes me on the question of energy. Right now, every American who is watching very disturbing images out of Ukraine should have in their mind that the United States is paying for that aggression by way of energy sales. We're not leading from behind right now on energy. We're chasing the caboose, running along the tracks. Canada has just banned Russian oil imports. Germany has just declared that they are going to eliminate all dependence on Russian energy and build new LNG capabilities. And yet still, as of 24 hours ago, the United States continues to buy oil from Russia. This is money that we are putting in Vladimir Putin's pocket so that he can attack Ukraine. I'd really like to see a change on that energy front, but it gets us to a bigger point. And Wojtek, I'd like to direct this question at you. Often, men like Ambassador Kerry and others have said, well, we need our energy relationships with Russia as a wedge to build up a relationship with them, and maybe we can use that to peel them off from their Chinese alliance. Often in pre-war, pre-invasion, many said we could do this. Wojtek, given what we've seen in Ukraine over the last 5 days, how would you judge the folly or the wisdom of those who still advocate in the United States that there is still a chance for us to peel Russia off from its alliance with China? And I'd welcome comments from other panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. A very brief answer, and I will pass the mic to my colleagues, experts on China. But I think that this is totally unrealistic. Trying to peel Russia from China with this common strategic vision and goal of undermining the security system to secure their vital interests is absolutely unrealistic. And I also think that trying to use this argumentation today that we need to keep the cooperation with Russia because we just need to secure the green transition, and we need to lower the emissions of CO2. It is just like you would make this argumentation in 1939 that, okay, let's accept that Hitler's demands because we need to cooperate with him in some areas, be it the climate or economy or whatever. We face the major war in Europe today that can really escalate from Ukraine to a war between Russia and NATO with the risk of nuclear escalation. And what we are doing today, it will really influence the Chinese calculations, how China will behave in the South China Sea and vis-a-vis Taiwan. So actually, even being deeply convinced that we need to have the green transition and we need to have a proper policy, and this is absolutely fundamental for most of the societies, this is not the moment to make these arguments today. This is what I would say.
If I may.
It works.
Okay. So a few words about the idea of accommodating. I know, right? Because it was before the aggression, there was a kind of discussion within Europe that maybe we should accommodate Russia against China, for example, to drive a wedge and to try to undermine this alliance, if I may put it this way. I think that, to be honest, from our point of view, from the Polish point of view, Central European point of view, of course, it was very strange just to accommodate Russia against China, as for us, the biggest threat, imminent threat is Russia, and right now we are seeing what is going on. But I think even for countries like, let's say, France, who it was a kind of an advocate of that accommodating Russia against China, I think that we should think about two issues. The first one is a normative agenda when it comes, let's say, about EU. Our normative projection of our normative values is a very important element. So how to accommodate, how to drive a wedge between two countries which are authoritarian, it is one issue. The second one, if we would like to, let's say, cooperate with China against Russia or with Russia against China, I think it would be not without any conditions. We should at that time we should accept, or we will be forced to accept some kind of those interests, let's say, sphere of influence when it comes to Russia, for example, that Ukraine is not a sovereign state or there's a partition or something also when it comes to China. So it's not costless. It's not without any conditions. They could force us to accept something which is some conditions coming from the authoritarian countries. And especially right now when we saw what China is doing, that is openly, explicitly supports Russia right now, with as many casualties within the civilians, still today, even looking at this readout between Wang Yi and Kuleba, the ministers of foreign affairs of China and Ukraine, they are talking about, let's say, some concerns about security with some hints about Russia, I think, still. But they have some wounded Chinese citizen. So I think it would be, so right now we could not even think about the possibility to cooperate with China against Russia or vice versa.
Just one note on this issue of ideas about how we can take Russia out and cooperate against China. I think it just goes out of the thinking that China is an ordinary country in terms of that it's very pragmatic in its foreign policy thinking, and it does not deal anyway in the notion that in the reality of Chinese policy, which is very much revisionist and very much ideological. And so we cannot analyze China as an ordinary usual country as we do comparisons. This is a very different political setup in China. So and all these theories of international realists are currently, actually, some of them are being used by the Chinese propaganda, like Professor Mersheimer, for example. He's quoted, his words are quoted by Chinese media, party media, in defense of Russia. Thank you.
Great. Did you have a comment that you wanted to get in before? Yeah, please. Yeah.
Just a couple of things. So,
and go ahead and introduce yourself so folks know.
Fellow here at Heritage Foundation, works mostly on naval warfare. So just a couple observations and your reaction as well. We talked about SWIFT, the alternative SWIFT, Chinese institution that developed now. The financial market could facilitated that. The question is, the Russians have a similar mechanism that they've worked on. Could that provide a relief mechanism for these economic sanctions? And if so, how much is needed to be effective near and into the long term? The other part of this is how deep. We haven't really gotten into the discussion of how much of this partnership, strategic partnership, is actually one of convenience driven by personal affiliations between Xi and his close advisors, as well as Putin and his close advisors. Now, there's a long historical and strategic animosity between the two that predates even the Cold War. So it's hard for me to see how this is a natural relationship. It's forced because of common interests that right now may be transitory. Maybe we're looking at this the wrong way when we talk about trying to pull West, to try to pull the Russians away from China. It might be better to make their interests diverge first rather than something else. But the personal aspect of it, and as a submarine officer served, the most dangerous of this relationship is not the economic, it is not the diplomatic collaboration between the two, appropriately coordination. A second level, a little bit more worrisome, is the coordination of military activities we saw in 2019. For me personally, watching this for many years, that was an event in the Sea of Japan where you had Chinese and Russian bombers fly around Takeshima or Dakto Island. It was a watershed event, and it's happened since in other places. But the most dangerous is a technological transfer between the Chinese and the Russians as it regards submarine quieting technology. That would actually be a strategic, a military, one type of technology capability that would go far beyond the military operational implications. And the analogy of this is you go back to 1979 to 80, the transfer of technology to the Soviets and how that impacted submarine warfare and the trajectory of the Cold War for a short while, till the Reagan buildup of the.
Yeah. If I can react to some of the things posted here before and to the points you raised on peeling off Russia from China or vice versa, I think that the debate is now shifting towards on how to peel China off from Russia. And one point I'd like to raise is that we should not fall into the same trap again. We've been talking about peeling Russia off from China for years now. And to me, it was a very convenient position for Russia. We've heard Russian diplomats and experts reaching out to the West saying, you know what, we're feeling oppressed. We are falling into this asymmetric relationship. Please help us. Please lend us money, provide us with technologies. And there were people in the West and even leaders in the West that really had this in mind. And the Russians were taking it and preparing to wage the biggest war there was in 30 or more years in Europe. Because there were only carrots on the table and not the sticks. And I think I'm really afraid of us making the same mistake vis-a-vis China. We may talk about carrots, okay, not to escalate the relationship too much, but I think that we also need a stick for China, saying that, you know what, if you support Russians right now, you will face tremendous consequences, diplomatic ones, but also economic ones. Say, we are now imposing a flurry of sanctions on Russia that include secondary sanctions. And we are debating whether China will throw them a lifeline. They might consider that. But if the structure of sanctions is one that prohibits anyone from touching Russian institutions, or otherwise they will face, bans on the EU or US markets, then China really think twice. And I think we need this kind of insulation of Russia here to kind of I'm not totally sure that China is willing or fully prepared to throw this lifeline, because we are talking about a 350 billion US dollars asset freeze. That's a thing that's like roughly 10% of China's own reserves. That it will take a lot for them to prop up ruble now. It's a big thing. I'm not sure they're ready for that. But anyways, if they wanted to do that, Russia is a great sell-off now. There's a 70% discount on anything that's in Russia now. It should be very tempting for the Chinese. Shell and BP are pulling off from Rosneft. A great time to buy it. But I think we need to make sure that if they do this, if they've thrown a lifeline with they have an interest in it. They will buy very great assets with that.
Yeah.
Maybe not altruistic one, but opportunistic one. I think we need to make sure that this kind of confluence of their interest and throwing a lifeline at the same time will not result in basically giving Russia some space.
Yeah, let me jump in on this, because I think great question, great response. It really, I think, gets to the key issue. And I really think that the strategy to destroy the leverage, the constructive leverage that they have with each other, is to just make Russia a less attractive partner for China. And so if we do the two things that actually checkmate Russia's capacity to threaten the stability and the solidarity and the prosperity of Western Europe, which is checkmate them with adequate conventional and strategic deterrence, and decouple from energy dependence on Russia, then what value does the Russian relationship really offer to China? China cannot help advance their interests. And if the answer, and then look, one of two things are going to happen. You're right. Either China will look at Russia and say, hey, garage sale, right? Which on the one hand seems, well, that's it. But anything that forces them to inefficiently do economic activity together actually in the end winds up becoming a greater burden on the Chinese economy. So that you're right. I mean, people say, well, we are financing Putin's war in Ukraine, which is technically true, right? Because we're idiots. We've driven the price of oil to $100 a barrel, and now he's got a ton of money, which is going to pay for this operation. But, it's going to consume a lot of money to fight this war. If they wind up occupying Ukraine, that's going to consume a lot of money. They've just wiped out their economy. That's a big burden. So, or the other thing either is that Russia buys, China buys Russia in a fire sale, or the Chinese start to look at Russia not as a partner, but as something on the menu, which I think in the end is much more likely that in order to sustain himself, Putin is going to spend a lot more time worrying about his Chinese friends and what they might do and how they might take advantage of his interest. So people who say, how do we decouple them? I think get this exactly wrong. Either it's, it's not about making nice to China and making nice to Russia. It's actually putting pressure on both of them actually is the way to put the greatest strain on their relationship. Sir.
Yeah, I could agree with this, but I just have this impression, or maybe this is another scenario that it's actually possible, because we would have to answer on what stage China in its foreign policy and internal policy is now. I mean, whether in its perception of rivalry with the US, mainly speaking, which is the most important thing from the Chinese perspective, right? Because I cannot exclude this possibility that they actually decided there is no way they can cooperate with the West anyhow. So, and that the decision, also from the ideological perspective, that this process in the party, and there is, we have to think about, we cannot think about China as making foreign policy or policy decisions in ordinary way, like debates on different topics and different circles exchanging opinions. I mean, so because if there was in a circle between Xi Jinping and his partners in the party, the decision that we engaged in a mode of conflict with the US, simply speaking, and its partners, and we want to go forward to reach to win this conflict, and then it actually doesn't really matter if they're actually decided they want to go forward. Then that this whole thing about convincing China to somehow not to cooperate with Russia in a way, that doesn't really matter, because they already are in the mood, in the stage, in the process of the conflict.
Can I just? Okay, please.
Why don't you go first, and then do you have a microphone? We get the microphone back over to Brent. Go ahead.
I promise to be brief. Just want to build something upon the thing Martin has raised. I mean, to me, in a very general sense, we are not on February 4th anymore, when China might have to hope that it will be a quick, humiliating exercise for the West. We are facing, this thing escalating, and Russia falling, collapsing economically. And to me, there's like first of all, on the escalation, I'm pretty sure China's not ready for World War III now, yet. It's the Congress is coming. Their capabilities in the Indo-Pacific are still few years away, and I'm pretty convinced if they want to engage in a big war, they will do this according to their own time schedule and not the Russian one. So this is probably the red line. But apart from that, we still have a number of escalation scenarios within Ukraine and Europe itself, a regionalized conflict. And here I would say I can see three scenarios here. First, the optimal for China. That's why they get into that. Russia applying pressure on the West, on Ukraine, killing so much civilians that they will finally drive a wedge within the West. Somebody would say, like, oh no, we are out of this business. And then that's a great, outcome for China, I guess. Of course, they don't want to be associated with the bombings of hospitals in Kharkiv. Of course, they don't. But the ultimate results of this scenario is basically good for them. Then we have the scenario two, that is the West is withstanding and is applying so much pressure on Russia that they basically fall into Russia's orbit, one way or another. You ask about the alternative payment systems and cutting Russia from SWIFT. Like, so far as to my knowledge, the Russian one, the SPS, is not going to fill the gap, because they've got like 300 something participants and there's only one Chinese bank there. It's like not ready. The Chinese one, on the other hand, is much better prepared. It's got more than 1,000 participants and many from Russia. The point is that it's a renminbi settlement mechanism. So it will if the Russians had no other options, they would be forced to use renminbi, and it's great for China. I mean, it's not optimal. The optimal outcome would be to actually use Russia to kind of destroy the West. But if this doesn't happen, they will fall into the orbit, and the infrastructure is partially there. And the third, the least optimal scenario, or the worst case scenario for them, is that we, as the West, stand firm, and there is a huge degree of resolve on our side. And then we are applying, like, constructing the sanctions in a way that China is not able to throw the lifeline. It's not about convincing them, it's about raising costs. And if the cost is so big that Russia will, like, rot itself without help, and this can mean a regime change in Russia, which is the worst case scenario for Xi Jinping. It's a nightmare. It's a source of destabilization, and it's also a proof that their closest ideological ally were themselves toppled by a popular revolt or oligarchical revolt, you name it. So I think that will be it. 3 scenarios that in terms, like, what's the preference of Chinese here.
We're going to go back to I'm going to go back to Brent in just a second, and then we'll go to Mars.
Just one
Okay, go ahead. Sure.
Just one sentence to clarify a little bit of what I was saying. I'm just not convinced about that the party and Chinese Communist Party engaged in this whole ideological, political dynamics and narrative is ready and is capable to adjust its policy so easily.
I think that's a great point. And I thought your scenario, I think that's really, spot on analysis. I'm going to break Brent for a second, but I just want to get to the point, because this has been a very rich discussion. But to be clear, what this really means for the U.S. The key to strategy is to be able to force your enemy to react to you rather than you to react to the competitor. And so part of what the United States has to do, if it's going to be a better transatlantic partner, and if it's going to be a better partner for our friends in the Indo-Pacific, is we have to have both the capacity and the capability, in a sense, to start to set terms of competition. And this fundamentally comes down to 3 things, because if the implicit in what I heard, one is military. I mean, we do this thing every year called the Index of U.S. Military Strength. That you can find it online. Just go on a search engine, go Heritage Index of Military Strength, or if you want, we'll send you the link to this. But we evaluate U.S. military capability looking at the operating environment, what the potential adversaries have, particularly China, Iran, and Russia. And by the way, if we have time, I want to get to the Iran issue here. And then we also look at U.S. military capabilities. So unless the United States has the capacity to both act in the European theater and in the Indo-Pacific theater, we can never really be proactive. That's one. The second one we've already talked about, which is energy. The United States has to become energy independent. So we're driving the global markets, not reacting to them. And the third one is our own economy. I mean, we've got a $30 trillion debt. That's unsustainable. We have potentially the most productive economy in the world. We have to get that post-COVID economy up and running. I think, honestly, many of the policies that we currently have, whether it's about green transition or are actually getting in the way of that. But if the United States, I think the United States can easily take advantages of the weaknesses in the Russia-China partnership and drive the competition, not in the way of going towards World War III, but in terms of convincing both parties that the advancing their interest through is very, very difficult in the face of American power. But we have to do all 3 things. We've got to have adequate military capacities in the Atlantic and Pacific. We have to drive more towards energy independence, and we have to have very strong economic growth. If we can't do those 3 things, and we can talk all we want about how we're going to deal with Russia and China, the United States isn't really a net contributor to dealing with that. So back to Brent, and then back to our panel, and we're at 11:52. So we have one comment, and then I think I want to finish up by giving the rest of our time to our panel. I did want to bring the Iran issue on the table. Because I think Iran's the chief destabilizing force in the Middle East. Iran, Russia, and China obviously all also have interest. Anything Iran does to destabilize the Middle East, I think, empowers both China and potentially Russia as well. And so I think that dealing with Iran is part of this mix. But folks can go there if they want, don't have to go there. One comment back to the panel, and then we're going to wrap in 8 minutes. So
real quick, I was going to bring up an Iran example to say how the sanctions regime worked. It actually made Iran a horrible business partner. So sanctions are a means to an end, and that end in the case of it's China and Russia is to make them horrible business partners to whoever would consider. So that's look at the sanctions as rather as a means and to that end specifically. The other is I don't think no matter what economic sanctions are levied, Putin and Xi are nationalist, and so if they associate an issue like Ukraine, obviously, Taiwan, very clearly in China, if they view it as a national or a legitimacy issue, which very clearly it is for the Communist Party in China, then it doesn't matter what the economic sanctions. If they have the military capability, they're going to go. And they have partners proximate in Russia. They can still exchange no matter how far we've isolated them before, during, or after whatever military action. So the caution on that is that nationalism or national interest will trump economic interest in the near term.
Very quick question. I do agree. I think the sanctions will not stop this guy now. He's been preparing for this for all his life, and at least for the last 8 years. And I'm talking here about using the sanctions to stop China from being a Russian enabler, rather than we can discuss the potential to use the sanctions to stop Putin, but that was not my point. My point is that Putin has his back held by the Chinese, and that's the point we could try to wedge with the sanctions. His behavior in Europe is another thing, especially in the following a week or so, because he's fully prepared for that. Thanks.
Instead of thinking in terms of driving the wedge between China and Russia, we also need to look for those areas of strategic cooperation between Europe and the United States, how we can further strengthen the cohesion of the West and to prepare the West for this long-term rivalry both with China and Russia. And those issues that you raised in your first intervention about closer military cooperation between China and Russia and in technological sphere, we definitely, and we have already started this process, we need a stronger technological policy, both in the EU and NATO. Of course, in the EU, there will be some part of political scene that will advocate that we need to have some kind of European sovereignty, but there will be also a large space for cooperation with the United States. And in NATO, we already implemented the policy on the development of new technologies. It is also an absolute opportunity for Euro-Atlantic community, for the West, to maintain the technological edge over both China and Russia, irrespective of their cooperation. And it will be absolutely fundamental, especially in the area. And you can also see the adjustment, repositioning of European states as far as cooperation with China is concerned. We have agreed a number of declarations between Poland and the United States, a number of states, European states with the US on the development of 5G networks that will be 5G, 6G, 7G in the future will be fundamental for the AI, artificial intelligence, which is another area where if China had too big access to our data, the opportunities for them to influence the political processes in the West would be just huge. So this is one of those areas where we need to put just a stop to this, the red line, and start decoupling. So just 3 final points. As we speak now, we need to limit the damage
that is by trying that Russia tries to inflict on Ukraine. We need to defend Ukraine. We will need to strengthen our defense and deterrence in Europe on a big scale, so Europe feels secure during this long-term military threat from Russia that we will face. The security of Europe will just strengthen the Euro-Atlantic cohesion, and Europe will be not that easily intimidated and divided both by Russia and China. And then we will be much better prepared for this long-term competition.
Sorry, last comments from the panel?
No, I want to hand you that.
Oh, no, sorry. Well, first of all, let me thank you. Hopefully you won't lose the sight of the forest for the trees here. These are two remarkable reports by two remarkable institutes. I would really recommend you go back and read them, because if you do read them, I do think they are foundational to understanding the reason why this crisis and the further invasion of Ukraine by Russia really matters, and why it is potentially an inflection point for Europe and the United States, and the need for some really hard strategic decisions. That this is an absolutely clear statement in our faces that this is not just a bump in the road, that after we're done with this crisis and this war and the fate of 44 million Ukrainians, that we can just go back to business as usual. This is like the guy that has, a heart palpitations, and it's like, oh, okay, I'm over that, but it's the sign of the coming heart attack. You need, this is a danger. This is a warning sign of exactly the kind of things that these analysts warned us about in their reports, and so I think I love the second panel, which I think really framed the hard choices that we have to make. And I think now it's really important to pay attention to this research, the research that we've highlighted in our transparency project, China Transparency Project, which you can find at heritage.org, and start pressing people in our countries and our leaders to start to have the difficult conversations about the reality of how we maintain our freedom and our safety and prosperity in the 21st century. Thank you all for participating. Thanks to our panel. Thanks for people that participated online. We will, if you registered, right, we will make sure that we send you links to the follow-up. We also will make sure we send you links to the event so you can share that with others, which we would love for you to do. And I hope that this is the first of many times that we get together and have an opportunity to share your research and expertise with an American audience. So I don't know if it'll be like, MTV or Joe Rogan podcast, but hopefully this will be an ongoing relationship, because what you guys bring to the table in terms of knowledge and expertise is really, really valuable for an international audience. But for an American audience. And so we are proud and honored to play a role with you guys in partnering to bring what you guys offer to maybe the most important discussions for the future of our planet. So thank you. Thank you, everybody.